Hello, I am Cynthia L. Simmons. I'm an author and a speaker, and I love history. And I believe that history is important for us to learn. You look back in the Old Testament, and Jesus told the Israelites to remember what he had done for them. He wanted them to set up memorials of things that he had done so that when the kids saw it, they could say, this is when God did this. So I think it's important for us to learn history, and I'm always studying history, so I figure I'm going to be able to give it away, and that's what I'm trying to do for you. So when I wrote Pursuing Gold, I had to study a lot about money, and I realized I had come across a topic that not many people knew as much about. So I thought it would be fun to go over how money got started. When I was a kid, I always thought of money as being green. And of course, it's green and black. But money hasn't always looked like this. In fact, today, we can think of money as being credit cards, because when you swipe your credit cards, you can have money taken right out of your checking account, or you can have it put on your account so you can pay later. So really, money is not just green, it's also credit cards. And nowadays with the computer, things can pass from bank to bank and never even be in your hands. But that hasn't always been the case. Years ago, people used to barter. For instance, if you had a farmer who produced corn, and you had a blacksmith who produced tools, they might get together and decide to exchange their services. But there were a few problems with that, and I'm going to talk about that. Years ago, I had to empty my dad's house. And when I did that, I discovered that people valued different things. I'd have people come into the house and I would say, would you like this item? And they would go, no, not really. I don't need that. But could I have that lamp over there? So what I learned was that people place values on different things, something that they need, something they can use. And depending on where they are in life and what they're doing, they may need something or not need it. So if you're going to barter, the person that you barter with must need the item that you're trying to barter with. And the other person, if you're working out a compromise between, say, a farmer and a blacksmith, you have to determine how much the value is the blacksmith's tool versus the corn or the wheat that the farmer has. And so really, it almost helps to barter with a third item. And whatever that item is, it needs to have some value. Here are some things that people have bartered with in the past. Rice. You can eat rice. Shells. You can take shells and make things out of them and make pretty pictures. Pretty stones, because they can be made into jewelry. Even salt. People have bartered with salt. They bartered with wheat and sugar. One of the most popular things to barter with was gold, because it could be used for so many other things. Gold and silver. Less silver because it tarnishes, but yes, people value silver. Salt was valued so highly that during Roman times, the Romans used salt to pay their soldiers. And that's where we get the saying, he's not worth his salt. In other words, he's not worth being paid. So early coins were made from precious metals. And so if I happen to use the word specie when I'm talking to you today, it's not a species of an animal that I'm talking about. I'm talking about gold and silver, which they began to make into coins. Years ago, if you saw some of the movies of the Old West and they had a gold coin, you would see men put it in their mouth and bite on it to see if it was soft, because gold is soft. And sometimes they would even cut the edges off because it was gold. And you've heard the saying, he was cutting corners. Well, that came from cutting the money, cutting the gold off of the coin so that it wasn't quite as much gold. So when they made gold into coins, they would first melt the gold and then press it into a mold. And a lot of times it would have the king or queen or whoever was the governor of the area. And it reminds me of that verse in Romans 12:2, where it says to not be conformed to the world. Because basically what they were doing is they were pressing that coin into a mold so that it would look like every other coin. And of course, for us, if we're not careful, the world can press us into their mold and make us as Christians look just like them, which we don't want to do that. We want our coins to look alike, but we don't want to look like everybody else. So when we talk about the gold standard, our nation used to be on the gold standard. And what we mean by that is that we could only buy and sell with gold and silver. Now, let's go back to colonial times. What you have here in the picture is a pound coin. And this is a current one. This is the Queen Elizabeth II is on the coin. And there aren't pounds that are in paper. This 1 pound coin is only a coin. You can get bigger denominations in paper, but it started off as coin. So the pound was the British system of money. It was based on the pound. And so the colonists also used the pound. And of course, they traded with other countries. And so the other ships that came in would bring in coins of different kinds. But sometimes the colonists didn't have enough coin to go shopping. And so at that time, wealthy individuals would make their own money. And of course, this money would stand for what the person had. This person was wealthy, so he would have something to back it up. But what he did was he would sign it so that it would prevent someone from being able to counterfeit, because paper is much easier to counterfeit than is gold or silver. And so if someone wanted to redeem this that had used it, they would bring it to the man that signed it and he would redeem it in gold. This was a piece of paper. It's very small. It's about the size of a notepad or a little sticky that we would use today. So it's not a full-size bill. And it had nothing on the back. Isn't that interesting? So people lived in Florida, and the people that lived in Florida were Spanish. And the Spanish used the dollar. And so because of that, there were some wealthy colonists that produced paper money in dollars. And again, the same thing, they signed it just in case you wanted to redeem that, you'd go back to the person that printed it. Now, the interesting thing about the colonies were, the colonies saw themselves as unto themselves. Virginia and Georgia, they were both just separate colonies. They didn't really have anything to do with each other besides the fact that they were both colonies. So if you took a pound bill from one colony to the next, you would get different amounts for that same coin. That colony might give it the face value, but Georgia might not give something from Virginia the face value that was written on the bill. So every colony kind of had their own way of handling the pound, the shilling, and so on. So it was real confusing. But then they thought of themselves as a colony under the king, rather than a bunch of colonies that were bound together in some way. Now, when the Revolutionary War began, at that point, they bound themselves together under the Continental Congress, and the Continental Congress produced money to fund the war. And here you see a colonist who is getting his gun ready to fight. Now, they adopted the Constitution, and Article 2 deals with legal tender. It still says it today that only gold and silver could be used for legal tender. So that meant that if you had to pay your bills, you had to use gold and silver to do it. And that's pretty significant. The coin law of 1793, once again, the dollar was the medium of exchange, and it specified the amount of precious metal in each one. For instance, the nickels actually had silver, the pennies had copper, and the other coins would have a mixture of gold or silver. But it set the exact amount, and this was in effect for a very long time. Now, the problem is, what if we run out of precious metals? That's all we can use to spend, but what if we run out? So I'm going to take a little detour here to explain that problem. You know that there are two types of banks. One bank is something that you would have in your house, like a piggy bank. And my grandmother gave me a special silver dollar when I was a little girl, and I put it in my bank. And I could go to the bank and get it out anytime I wanted to, and it was my silver dollar. However, there is such a thing as a commercial bank. I could go put my silver dollar in a commercial bank, and they would put it on a piece of paper that I had that much money in their bank. But I would not get that silver dollar back if I went to the bank, because they would put it out to make loans with it. What a commercial bank does is that they take people's money, keep a record of how much they've got, and then they loan it to people who are starting businesses, and they charge interest. And with the money they make, that's how they fund their bank. And so they actually make money with your money. Now, here's where our problem comes in. Banks in Europe, they were all over the place, and they were family banks, and they could do what we do today, and they could switch money between banks pretty easily because they knew each other. But Andrew Jackson came along, and he did not want us to have a national bank, and that's a national commercial bank, so they would be easy to pay people. So instead, we had regional banks, and these regional banks would be controlled by the state. The state would license them. If they began to run low on coin, which they did unless there was a gold rush like the gold rush of the 1850s, at that time there was not enough gold. And so the gold rush of the 1850s did bring more gold into the government so they could print more coin. But what happened was that the regional banks would print money, that you could go to that bank and get gold in exchange for that paper money. However, the back was not printed. It was only printed on the front. And if the bank went out of business, which was very common, they would call that a broken banknote, because there was nobody who would redeem it, and so it was worthless. And so it really was better to use the coin, because people valued the coin because of the metal that was in it. Now, until the Civil War, our government functioned primarily on coins with the gold and silver and copper, and a few banknotes by banks, by regional banks. This was primary, although there was probably still situations where people bartered. That has never completely gone away. However, during the Civil War, Lincoln was president, and we developed a problem. And that is that in 1861, they were running out of coin. Because what happens in a war is that you need more materials. You all of a sudden have to start putting your soldiers in uniform. You have to buy weaponry. You have to buy bullets. And they didn't have enough money. They didn't have anything to spend. And so the government decided to publish what they called the demand note. And this demand note could be exchanged for gold at the Treasury. You could still take it to the bank and say, I want gold. That's why it was called a demand note. And they deliberately chose green for the color. And they chose green because it could not be counterfeited. It was much harder at the time to make that color of green. So the bills were green and black, and they had something on each side. So they were called greenbacks. And these bills were much larger than the ones today. They were like 7¼ by 3. They were quite a bit bigger. And it wasn't until later that they shrunk the bill down because it was cheaper to make a smaller bill. Okay, this is an example. I don't think this is exactly it, but this is an example of some early money. And this money took a long time to produce because they actually had people come in, design all of this stuff, and the pictures were done with carving. You know, they had to carve it so they could stamp it. It took a very long time. It was a lot of artsmanship, a lot of work with artists that did this. Now, in March of 1862, they had another problem. And that is the government was about to go bankrupt. And this is the federal government. And so Chase, who was the treasurer at the time, came to Lincoln and said, we are going to have legal tender. Otherwise, we can't continue with the war. We'll have to stop. And so Lincoln laughed and said, what are we going to put on that bill? And he said, we could put on there, silver and gold have I none, but such as I have I offer to thee. And of course they did not do that, but that was his joke. So they passed a legal tender bill and put money out as legal tender. And at that point, you could not go to the bank and say, I want gold. That ended. But people began to hoard their gold because that's what they were used to using, and they did not want their bills. And so the government ended up having to print what is called fractional currency. And this currency was, again, that was the legal tender. You had to use it to pay your bills, but it was very small, slightly bigger than a little sticky note, but it would be for less than $1. And this is an actual fractional note for 10 cents. I took a picture of it. There were fractional notes for 75 cents, 5 cents, 1 penny, and so on. This is what they had to use during that time. Now, the Confederacy was a different situation because they had to adopt a constitution and they had to decide how they were going to fund their government. They kind of had to start from scratch. Well, they adopted the Constitution exactly as the North had. The only thing they changed was that they added that Black people were inferior and must always be in bondage, which of course we don't agree with that. But the vice president of the Confederacy was Alexander Stephens, and he said that it was the perfect Constitution because of that one element. So again, they had to form a new government. They had to figure out what they were going to do. They had to raise money. They had to buy uniforms like the North did, except that they did not have the industrial capacity of the North. And so they had to start developing that. And then, of course, there was a blockade that kept them from trading. So they had a lot more problems. Now, when the Confederacy first started, there were women who got together and said, let's cut our hair and sell it to give to the government for the war. Because it was actually a government that did that in Europe years before. And they actually were able to fund the entire war simply by selling their hair in Europe. Well, in this case, they couldn't fund the entire war. But the Confederacy decided that they were going to fund their government with loans, which meant that they had to start issuing loans. And one of the first things they did was that they issued what is called a loan that was a bond. And of course, they assumed wealthy people and banks would be doing it. So a lot of banks saw this as a good opportunity. The loan, the bond did bear 8% interest, so they could make money off of the money that they loaned the government. And so they saw this as a good opportunity to make some money. So a lot of the big banks did this. A lot of wealthy individuals did that. They also published what is called a treasury note, which they published in large denominations, thinking that it would only be between banks and wealthy individuals. And these also bore interest. But the thing about it is, both of these, both the bond and the treasury bills, began to be used in the South before the war was over, because there was first of all, prices increased, so they needed the bigger denominations, and also they had to have something to spend. Now, they also put out money in smaller denominations for the average person, but again, that was a loan, except that they would not redeem it until after the war. So basically, they started moving toward a legal tender in paper, but they didn't do it because they had certain rules about what you could use this money for. For instance, if you had to pay your taxes to the government, you could not use the paper money because they didn't think that was worth anything. That was a loan to you. They wanted gold for that. And of course, each state, it was kind of like the colonies. Each state was kind of unto themselves. And they would look at the fact that they had loaned the government money, and they would go, okay, well, this month, my money that I loaned them would make this much money. So this is how much money I have now. Because it got to be a problem in terms of what the states were going to spend. So the bank, anybody that had loaned money to the government would say, well, this is how much money I will have when the government pays me back. And so then they would issue money themselves based on what they thought they had, including all that interest. And so what happened was that money was all different shapes and sizes and colors. And so there was no standard, which was a perfect way for counterfeiters to come along and make a lot of money, because they could pass out counterfeit bills and spend them and do whatever they wanted to do. And so there was a lot of counterfeit money because there was no standard. In fact, I've heard people say that the counterfeit money was actually a better quality than some of the money that was out there that was published legitimately. Well, this created a really big problem because people did not like the paper and they didn't know if it was worth anything. So if you went to a store and you took a dollar bill and it was just printed by whoever, the store might not give you $1 for it. They might say, I'm not going to take that. I need coin, or I need something else. For instance, they would go back to bartering with something, or else I'm not going to trade with you, or I will give you half of the value. There were court cases over this in every state, but every state was slightly different because they were all into themselves. Some states would try to enforce it, other states would not. Tennessee they printed money and they said that it was legal tender and you could even use it to pay taxes. But of course, when it came to pay the Confederacy, they couldn't use that to pay the Confederacy when they paid taxes. They had to have gold. So when we say legal tender, and that is what's on your bill today, your bill will say legal tender for all debts, public and private. What that means is you can pay your taxes with it. You can use it at the store, but in the Confederate days, there were restrictions on what you could do with it, or even what someone might accept it. If you owed them money, they might not accept it. So it really wasn't legal tender. This is an example of a Confederate bill. They were printed on both sides, but they were, obviously, this is put out by the Confederate States of America, but they were not standard. However, there was a lot of work that went into these bills. The people who produced them did a lot of engraving, very, very intricate work, and they are really very beautiful. Now, to go back to the Union, obviously, when the South fell, most of the banks that had loaned at least half of their money away to the government, they crashed. In fact, there's people that talk about Confederate gold. There was nothing left. What happened was that the government actually had to pay their bills. They had to pay certain bills, and then the money that was left went to Georgia under guard and was used to pay the soldiers. What little was left belonged to a Virginia bank and was converted to silver, and then sent back. So there was never any Confederate gold left anywhere or buried anywhere. So once the government began to publish money, the federal government, which I'm speaking of the United States, then they had to figure out how to capture counterfeiters. So in 1865, they formed the Secret Service to catch counterfeiters. It was not founded to protect the president, which it does today. There's an interesting story about this because, of course, Lincoln died in 1865 and was buried in Springfield. His tomb at the time was just a little place in the side of a mountain with bars so that you could actually see the sarcophagus. Well, there was a bunch of counterfeiters from Chicago, and the government had captured their engraver and put him in jail, and they wanted their engraver back. So they decided that they were going to get Lincoln's body and use it for ransom. And so on election night, when they figured everybody was going to be busy, they broke into the tomb and tried to pull his casket out of the sarcophagus. However, their clan had been infiltrated by the Secret Service, and the Secret Service caught them before they got the sarcophagus out of the tomb. And so they didn't actually steal the body, but they just violated the tomb. So for that crime, these counterfeiters spent a year in jail, which I think that is hilariously funny that they only spent a year in jail for something like that. But the point is that the Secret Service was founded to stop counterfeiters, and they didn't start to protect the president until several years later. I think it was under Garfield, after Garfield was assassinated, that they began to do that. So today, we have to think about what our money is today. We think of it as paper, but it is not really paper. Our money today is cotton and linen, and it has a type of ink that is almost gives off a glow when it's put under certain lights. And if you notice the dollar, they have different features in them, and the bigger the denomination, the more features, safety features that you will see. They'll have strips in them that are magnetic. They'll have watermarks in them where the paper has a picture in it from the actual making of the paper. So there's all kinds of security features in our dollars that keep people from counterfeiting, because that's one of the worst problems with money is counterfeiting, because dollars are much easier to counterfeit. Now, let me tell you a story about this. I have been to England several times, and once when I went to England, I had been before, and I had some pounds left from the time before. So I went to the register to pay for my purchase, and I pulled out my pounds, and the lady at the register said, "This has expired. You can't use this." And I went, "What? You're telling me what?" And it was such a shock to my system because I didn't understand that whole idea. But it turns out that paper money in England expires because they aren't as good at preventing counterfeiting. And so they have to take the dollars back at a certain, or their pounds back at a certain point. And so they said, if you'll take it to the bank and just hand it to them, they'll give you another one. It doesn't even matter that you're a foreign individual. And so that's what I did. But in contrast, our government, if they ever produce coins or paper and it's actually authentic, you can use it regardless of how old it is, and they'll give you the face value for it. Now, of course, if it's very old, it might be worth more than the face value, but they will give you the face value for it. So that's really interesting. But yes, if you look at your dollars, they do have more features now than they used to, because they're always trying to get ahead of the counterfeiters. And again, these bills are done by artists who sit down and engrave plates and put a lot of intricate work into them. And so they're very pretty. So look at your dollars and appreciate the material on them. So here's some interesting facts about money. Bartering came before money. Early governments made coins from precious metals. governments preferred coins since they had value, but during a war, they would often go to paper. In Europe, they were more advanced than we are. They had family banks and they began to use checks and so on and move money before we did. We had no national bank, so we didn't start checks or bank drafts until later. Paper money began for both sides at the Civil War, and paper money today is made of linen and cotton with security features. Any paper money ever printed in the U.S. is still accepted. So, this is research from my novel Pursuing Gold, and this is a story of a Confederate bank, and someone is counterfeiting money against that bank, and they have to find them before they cause the bank to fail. So this is a really fun story in dealing with money, and you can even learn more about what it was like at that time. I also have written a curriculum that goes with this book. It's for homeschoolers or anybody that is interested in more. There is a lot of material in here in terms of history, and I also have material in here on how kids can learn to handle their money and avoid debt. So I hope you have enjoyed this study, and I hope you will go to my website and learn more about me, because I have a lot to offer you. I want to thank you for listening and thank you for joining me today.